So I was going to address insect management. Really, I'm going to break it down into various modules. And what I'd like to do is go over some of the basics, then talk about some specifics on some specific vegetable crops. And later on, I'm going to talk about some specifics on fruit crops. One thing you'll notice is the degree of similarity with some of the messages that you get from the different discipline specialists, that a lot of times we're saying the same things. I was joking around with Emily earlier that if you just took her talk and you removed the words diseases and you inserted insects, a lot of it would be the same. And it is a very, very similar message. So let's go ahead and get started. Just, you know, for growers that are new to organic production, and a lot of growers like organic production because it helps them get away from synthetic insecticides. I mean, insecticides really can carry a negative connotation with a lot of growers, and so this is one area that they're very sensitive to. One thing, certain crops are going to be much easier to grow organically than other crops. And so that's one thing to keep in mind. Just because they fail on certain crops growing them organically doesn't mean that there aren't other crops that they can be very successful with. In terms of organic production, there is much less reliance on insecticides. Part of that is because the organic insecticides may not be as effective as some of the conventional insecticides. They have less residual activity, and we don't always have insecticides for all the pests that are attacking fruit and vegetable crops for home gardeners. So there really is a limited arsenal out there for some of our organic growers, particularly in home garden situations. We're going to have much more reliance on natural enemies, and we're going to base everything on cultural and mechanical controls. And so that's really the first step. So those are going to be some of the first things I discuss here. One thing with organic management, and the same is true for conventional production, is it's very difficult to manage situations when they've been let to get out of control. So we really emphasize identifying problems in their infancy and not waiting for things to really get out of control. We don't have good tools that we can react to severe problems with. And so that is a situation we have to work with. And keep in mind that, you know, homeowners, they often don't recognize the types of problems they have. And I'm speaking to the choir here, you all know that, but a lot of the problems that they're dealing with may not be disease related, they may not be insect related. They're the non-biological things, you know, the plants being in the wrong place, water, temperature, nutrients, all sorts of other things that can cause disorders with the plants. Extremely important that home gardeners be able to recognize the pests and the signs associated with it. I'm always an advocate that if you cannot recognize the problem, you cannot manage it effectively. So always the first step with everything is recognizing the problem you're dealing with it. Correctly identify the pest, and once you have the pest identified, encourage, you know, particularly if it's a recurrent problem, they need to get to know about the insect life cycle. Because then they can start to look at weaknesses in that life cycle that we can exploit to manage that pest. Monitoring. I can't stress this enough, that people need to be going out there at least weekly and monitoring their garden, whether it be their fruit trees, their vegetable plants, or even their other landscape plants. Check weekly because we're looking for the earliest stages of some of these pests. We need to catch them when they're young. Younger stages generally are much easier to control than some of the tougher older stages. So we need to catch them very young. They need to do more than just walking past their plants. Insect pests tend to be down in the bud, underneath the leaves. They do need to be getting down on their hands and knees, flipping over leaves, and looking hard for some of these insects. And a lot of times the insects aren't there, so we recommend that they look for signs of insect damage. And I tend to think of it as holes and honeydew. You know, holes are from insects with chewing mouth parts, honeydew, insects with sucking mouth parts. And so those are two key things that they can use to help identify at least the groups of insects that may be causing problems. Take notes. The older I get, the more important this becomes, just because my memory is not what it used to be. And sometimes it's hard keeping track of what happened yesterday as opposed to last week. And so taking notes are very important. And the reason is, it's helpful to know, is the pest problem staying the same as it was last week or 3 weeks ago? Is it getting worse, or is it going down? And even if you don't have an economic threshold, just knowing the direction a pest problem's going is very, very helpful. And it helps people remember next year, oh yeah, I had a serious problem with that particular pest. Let me see if there's a resistant variety, or if, you know, can I move the planting in another place where I don't have that problem? So the notes are very, very important. And lastly, we tend to focus in on the plants not doing well. We don't look at the nice plants, the bullish plants that are bigger than everything else. We're looking at the weak plants, the tattered plants, the ones with the wilting leaves, and those are the ones that they need to be focusing in on. Traps. We do have some traps out there. So homeowners can use some of these traps that are available for everyone. Some things like coddling moth, European corn borer, dogwood borer, spotted winged Drosophila. I think that's a very useful trap, and brown marmorated stink bug. We have traps for each of those pests, and so they can use those to help monitor pest populations. They're not really used to eliminate pests, but they're used to help monitor for the pests. There's very little research documenting that the use of these traps will reduce pest populations. The other thing they need to think about is the tolerance level on plants. You know, not every insect that occurs in a garden is going to cause them problems, even if it is a pest. So, you know, they need to come up with what level they're willing to tolerate. You know, they can balance this against, you know, how big of a planting they want to put into their yard. You know, if they're losing 50% of their yield, well, if they just double their planting in the beginning of the spring, that's one way of dealing with it and increasing that tolerance level. So it all comes down to time, energy, and how much they can spend on that. They also need to know the tolerance levels of the plants. So things that defoliate plants, the leaf feeders, we tend to have pretty high tolerance with those. For example, in beans, you can take 20 to 40% defoliation. The plants can look absolutely horrible, but there's still no yield loss. But when you have insects that tunnel into plants, insects that threaten the health of the plant besides just the defoliation, those are the ones that we're most concerned about. And the age of the plants. You know, seedlings cannot tolerate the amount of feeding that a mature plant can tolerate. So keep in mind how that tolerance changes as the season progresses. So developing an organic management plan. I don't have a nice triangle. I really like the triangle for disease management, but this is very similar though. We have cultural controls, and you notice they're at the top of the list. Organic sprays, I put it in smaller font. I tried to reduce the color there and put it down in the bottom. So de-emphasizing organic sprays, emphasizing cultural controls. Cultural controls, you don't react to a pest problem with implementing a cultural control. These are preventive in nature. These are things like selecting your varieties, planting dates, and things like that before you ever see the pest problem. That's when you make the decisions with your cultural controls. We have physical controls, and then we have biological controls. And so those are some of the things I'm going to be talking about this morning.